Hello and welcome to Mine Explorers episode 45, where I'm joined today by myself. I'm going to cover this one. Crystal's at the AEMA conference in Reno, Nevada. Just the last day of the conference wrapping up today, so she's there getting the booth taken down and setting all that up. But the AEMA, fantastic organization, the American Exploration and Mining Association. So it's kind of a hybrid of the worlds of exploration and mining, but they tend to lean a little bit more on the exploration side, which is what we really like. And so, but great advocates for the industry. So they just wrapped up their conference where they had a variety of short courses and technical talks. And then this year they introduced a lightning type talks concept where everyone gets 5 minutes to go up and talk about their project or their product or their service. And Crystal participated in that and did a very good job. She talked about GIS and exploration and the importance of using GIS and some of the insights that can be had from it. And she gives some case studies, which is great. But for this episode, I'd like to talk about my outlook for the future of the U.S. mining industry and the macro outlook for 2026. I recently put together a report for this. It started as a project Crystal had me put together. She said, "Stuart, can you put together an outlook for the next year for Burgex that we can present at our offsite annual planning meeting?" And I did that. And then I quickly realized, well, this could have a lot more use for people outside of our industry and outside of, just specifically Burgex. I can broaden it out and make it applicable to explorers and miners alike and other people who have an interest in mining and critical minerals and understanding some of the macro trends that are affecting our industry today and affecting geopolitics and the United States and what's going on. So the nice thing with this is I have been producing this show now with Crystal for, coming up on a year. This is episode 45. We've done one a week. And in doing that, researching all the topics, there's the normal things that I pay attention to and track and put together in some of our market reports we're doing. And then there's all the different topics and things that we look up for the show, which has given me exposure to a lot of other things and different segments of what's going on here in the United States economically to kind of give more of an outlook. So this is the culmination of about a year of research combined into a short 16-slide deck that I will go through, and I will have a download link down in the description and also in the comments where you can go download a copy of this report for yourself and take a look and see if you find some interesting things in there. I think this is important for anyone who's a decision maker or just wants to be more informed about what's going on in the industry. So a little bit about myself and what I see. I wrote a nice little introduction letter here. And kind of the conclusion that the TLDR is that I'm an elder millennial and I grew up with computers, but I also remember a world without cell phones and smartphones and things like that. And even in computers, my first computer was a Commodore 64 that my dad dusted off for me and let me use, which kind of taught me how to do some basic coding and programming and things and learn about computers. But I've seen tremendous shift. And when it comes to AI adoption, I was one of the first people to sign up for ChatGPT. I was in the first 10,000. So really early on that. And I've been using it daily since. I use Gemini, I use Grok, I use some of the others. And so really interesting shift in technology, and I'm seeing how that's starting to play out in the mining industry in this big pivot. There's these geopolitical trends meeting these technology trends, and it's creating a really interesting situation for the industry. I'm not going to read all the text in this, just kind of go over the high points and the overview, and then you can download it and check it out later if you want to really dig into the details. But basically we're seeing a tectonic shift, the end of globalism. So after World War II, we had what's called Bretton Woods, and the United States basically became the world police in exchange for free trade and keeping trade markets open globally, and it was kind of the birth of globalization. The United States kind of acted as the world police. And over the years, there's been a lot of weariness and a lot of discontent from the US public about this role. And Donald Trump, I like to say, he's not the cause of this shift towards nationalism away from globalism. He's a symptom of it, and so it's given him a platform to push a lot of the stuff that was probably going to happen anyway in terms of shifting from globalism to nationalism. But I don't think this is new to anyone. I think this is playing out. Peter Zeihan is a really good geopolitical analyst, and he looks at things through a lens of geography. So he looks at the economics and geopolitics through a lens of geography. And he's been writing for years now, over 10 years, about how this was going to happen, this shift from globalism to nationalism. And now we're actually seeing it happen in real time. There's talk now, Thomas Massey from Kentucky, Representative Massey just proposed a bill that would withdraw the United States from NATO. And while it's not likely to happen, it shows what's going on in this shift, and it's very interesting. But what it means for mining in the metals is that there is a big bifurcation happening, and I'll use that word in a few different contexts in this report. But in terms of the end of globalism, now we're seeing that the location of mineral deposits is really key. And it was key before for reasons like grade and transportation and geopolitics, of course, and the jurisdiction you're in has always mattered. But now we may have two completely separate supply chains, an eastern supply chain driven by China and other countries, and then a western supply chain with the United States and its allies that develop key critical minerals, which is a term that's thrown around a lot as well. But in this case, we're talking about rare earths, we're talking about metals that are key for defense, and then we're talking about copper and metals that are important for electrification, as well as other battery metals, is what I'm talking about when I talk about critical minerals in context of this presentation. But that kind of sets the stage. So we have this shift. And then on top of this, we have this emerging AI race. And we've talked about this. If you've been watching the show, none of this will be really new because we're combining multiple things to kind of provide an outlook of what's coming. But there's this new Cold War where the AI is developing, and there's a lot that can be done in terms of training and algorithms and on the software side, but the hardware needs to keep up. So there's this physical infrastructure that needs to be built, and there's a race, and there are huge companies, Amazon, Google, Oracle, Microsoft, who are racing to build data centers and supply critical minerals and materials, and also energy, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there's a sovereign component as well, where there's countries like China and the United States and the EU and the UK and others who are interested in also being able to dominate this AI space. And what this means is, if AI can be the new super weapon, it's like nuclear weapons. If AI gets to a point where it's able to crack cryptography, and it's able to crack encryption, it could bring down the global financial system. You could break Bitcoin. You could do all number of things, especially when you pair it with quantum computing. And they definitely work together. Quantum computing can make AI much stronger and more powerful in a hardware sense, and also training. But also AI can help come up with new and creative ways to tackle quantum computing and solve all the numerous challenges there. But the first country or company to be able to crack encryption on like a Bitcoin level can bring the whole world to its knees. And so there's really a cold war going on for AI, and that's just kind of the end of the spectrum. But there's numerous other economic and security benefits to having a more advanced AI than your adversary. So we layer the bifurcation and the shift from globalism to nationalism, and different economies and supply chains emerging where they're splitting. And then we have this AI race going on. And the statistics are just insane with the AI race. So there's different estimates, between $500 and $600 billion of proposed capital expenditure for data centers in the United States in the next year. So in 2026, it's almost $600 billion for AI data centers. And this affects everything from, obviously, copper and minerals that are used to build semiconductors, but all the way through to construction materials, cement, concrete, all the materials that build the buildings, and then of course all the infrastructure, which means again more copper, steel, and then all of these data centers have an enormous power requirement, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they also need to be on all the time because uptime is so critical. And so these have backup battery banks, which drives battery materials and other things. And then again, we're seeing kind of this bifurcation that we talked about. So the bulk of this CapEx is in the United States. And then China has a huge amount, as well as Europe, Japan, India, and then on and on and on. But the United States is still far and above the leader in spend for this. But you could see China scale up very quickly like we've seen with other types of projects. So what does this all mean for precious metals? Well, there's a whole divergence of other factors that are affecting precious metals outside of what we just talked about. So we have this monetary and industrial super cycle that's kind of a dual engine bull market for precious metals that could be a 10-year bull market, potentially even more. We're really seeing a perfect storm of structural supply deficits, particularly in silver, and a global flight to tangible assets such as gold. So we have this return to hard money, which we'll see in a minute with Chinese central bank gold buying. And we have growing industrial demand and short physical supply. And this is a lot more pronounced than a lot of people think. So in China, what we're seeing is central bank buying is reported at about 25 tons a year. But the reality is probably 10 times that, based on data coming out from London and Swiss refineries that are actually making these deliveries, are estimating that up to 10 times the amount of gold is flowing into Chinese central banks than is being reported. Now, this is really interesting because the offset, where would this capital go otherwise? Well, it would go into United States treasuries. But instead of going to treasuries, it's going to a hard asset, and they're buying gold bullion that's sitting in a vault. Then on the silver side, we talked about there's a supply deficit. So silver is key for EVs, it's key for solar panels, it's key for a lot of industrial applications. It goes into these data centers and everything else that's going on. Well, demand is projected to continue to climb and has been climbing between, I have a chart here for 2021 to 2026, but supply has remained relatively flat. Now, it's not exactly flat for this chart, it's been simplified, but it's been relatively flat. There have not been significant increases in supply, but there are significant increases in demand. So we have a gap. Now, how has this been filled? We can see this is not new. This has been going on since 2021. Well, approximately 800 million ounces have been pulled from existing stockpiles to plug the gap. These warehouses are running empty. So we have a literal physical squeeze on silver. Now, a lot of you are silver bugs, you're connected to silver bugs, you've at least read their analysis and stuff. None of this is new to the precious metal space, the silver supply. But some of the central bank buying is probably pretty shocking to a lot of people. 250 tons of gold is an enormous amount of gold. I'm not great with math unless I have a spreadsheet in front of me. And so I can't do the conversion to ounces really easily, but it's an enormous amount of ounces. It's several large mines worth of output that they're buying that's unreported. It's a ghost buying. So we have these two different converging factors on precious metals, and this is going to create a bull market that's going to last for quite some time. Analysts are saying gold, $4,500 gold in 2025 is kind of a base case now, and we could see up to $5,000. And as we saw in the last year, it could significantly exceed that. Doesn't mean there's not going to be pullbacks and gaps and dips along the way like there are in any bull market, but we are definitely entering a bull market. And I think sentiment in the industry confirms this with the mergers and acquisitions and shakeups that are happening at the top of some of these companies. The industry knows, and they're trying to position, and particularly in silver, we're really just getting started. So, critical minerals, hype and reality. For those of us in the mining industry, we've enjoyed or not enjoyed, depending on how you look at it, a lot of quiet when it comes to media exposure. There hasn't been a lot of discussion around mining and what's going on, but in the last few years with this critical minerals thing, there's a lot more interest in rare earths. There's a lot more interest in copper and other things that are going on. And when I think critical minerals personally, copper is at the top of the list. And then I think of lithium, I think of things like tungsten and antimony, and then I think of rare earths. And rare earths is a big basket. There's a lot of interesting rare earths in there, and each one of them has their own market and their own supply and demand and economics. But this ties back to the tectonic shift in the geopolitics, because all of these minerals, for the most part, exist in abundance on the planet, and there's adequate processing and refining capability to meet today's needs. Not the needs of the future, but today. Now that that market's bifurcating and we have separate supply chains being set up for different things, the supply and the processing capability, there's a huge divergence. And so let's dig into that a little bit. I've got a really great chart here on this next page. I put together a radar, so minerals on the radar. And you can see here on a 0 to 10 scale, I have domestic supply, domestic processing capability, global supply, global reserves, and I have reserves, global reserves, and domestic reserves for copper, lithium, nickel, and rare earth minerals. And you can see here, there's a different picture that kind of emerges for all of them. There's pretty good domestic reserves, and by domestic, I mean the United States, for everything but nickel. And the nickel we do have some nickel, but we don't have a lot. But we have nickel in neighboring jurisdictions. I know there's plenty of rifts between the United States and Canada right now, but they are a long-term ally. They're so economically connected and dependent that the rifts that are happening now are temporary. They may last a few years, but eventually things will merge back together. And when push comes to shove, we're very strong allies and will remain so. So we have nickel in Canada, but in terms of the United States, we don't have a lot. But when it comes to copper and lithium and rare earth elements, the reserves are here. But if you look on the radar at the processing and the processing capacity, it is severely lacking for all of the different elements. that we're studying here. So it's lacking for copper, it's lacking for lithium, almost non-existent for nickel. And for rare earths, we have the Mountain Pass mine and then a lot of pilot and other projects that could be coming online, but they're not online yet. So 2026 processing capacity is very limited. You can see globally, it's fine. Global supply, global reserves for all of these are pretty good, in pretty good shape, but domestic supply and domestic processing capacity are very lacking. Then I break down the individual components. So copper, I talked again about copper and how important copper is. There's a structural shortage by next year of potentially up to 150,000 metric tons of deficit just this next year. We're not talking about 20 years in the future, 5 years in the future. We're talking about next year, 150,000 tons. Now, when you talk in terms of reserves, that doesn't seem like a lot. But when you think that 150,000 tons of copper comes from copper grades of 1% or less on average, it's a huge amount of refined copper that's going to be short. And that's only going to grow. And I don't know how many of these factors are included in that, but a lot of that's data center and infrastructure demand, and then energy demand, which we'll talk about in a minute. Lithium, plenty of lithium supply. There is processing capacity that can come online, but there's still permitting delays and things like that, particularly on the processing. But we've done a great job of proving up reserves over the last decade. We've 10x'd the amount of domestic reserves for lithium. Rare earth elements. Once again, we're building a great base of domestic reserves across a lot of different types of deposits and a lot of different geologic environments, but processing capacity is still lacking. And as we talk about a lot in rare earths, and as a primer for those who haven't looked into it as much, rare earths are not rare, but they're generally not found in high concentrations to make them economic. And a lot of the economics are driven by the expense and difficulty of separating these elements out. So you'll find a rare earth deposit that has 10 different elements in it that could potentially be economical if they had the processing capacity, but building a processing facility that can produce all of the different elements is very expensive and very difficult, and the economics are hard, and most of the expertise resides in China. Now, what's going on to solve this? Well, there is a sovereign premium being placed on critical minerals projects in the United States that's backed by the federal government. There's over $4 billion in funding for different projects related to critical minerals, particularly in batteries, in rare earths, and pilot plants. These things are really growing and will continue to grow, and basically it's putting a backstop on this, and the federal government's taking a direct equity position in critical minerals companies. They're stockpiling materials. The Department of War is buying them up and taking a very serious interest in this, and so this is going to continue through 2026 and beyond, but we really need more copper. We need more processing capacity for all the elements. Now, energy. We can't talk about all these AI data centers and all this infrastructure build and all this stuff about copper without talking about energy. So now we're shifting from a pure green energy transition, which we've really been looking at over the last decade or more. We're shifting to an urgent energy expansion. And this requires, yes, an expansion in supplies that are renewable, but primarily we need base load power. We need power that's available 24/7, it's reliable, it can be turned on and off, scaled up and down, and nuclear is the the real answer here. And so there's a huge interest in restarting nuclear power plants, building new power plants, small modular reactors, and just building up the grid. And this is very bullish for energy minerals and grid metals. So like we talked about before, once again, copper. So Morgan Stanley just completed a report about a month ago, and they estimate that by 2028, there is if all these data centers get built that are talked about, by 2028, there's a 44 gigawatt gap in the amount of power that's going to be needed to power these data centers. AI data centers are extremely power hungry, and they're being built at a rapid pace because making smarter, faster, better AI requires more AI data centers, which requires more energy. And so there's this huge gap. Now, first off, this is going to require 44 gigawatts it's 44 new average size nuclear power plants. It's impossible. We can't plug that gap. So what's going to need to happen is we're going to need to restart every facility that's currently idled or shut down, which is going on. 3 Mile Island, Microsoft's working with Constellation to get that started back up. SMR plants are starting to really look attractive. So SMR, small modular reactors. So these are little miniature nuclear power plants that are safe, reliable, very low waste, very low footprint, easier to permit, easier to staff, easier to build. They're modular too. So you can have one and then another one and then another one and then another one. You can expand and contract and move them around as needed, which is the beauty of those. But really the reality is energy is the bottleneck. So what we're seeing is this Silicon Valley put. And I think this is really interesting. So we've basically gone from Chernobyl, nuclear's bad, it's dangerous, to this clean compute narrative where all of these big tech bros, as I like to call them, and definitely didn't coin the term, but these tech bros, Sam Altman, Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Bezos, they control an enormous amount of the media and public sentiment through X and YouTube and Facebook and like the Washington Post and the traditional media that they own. And so they are strategically and slowly shifting the narrative to be pro-nuclear, pro-energy, and this is shifting sentiment and driving policy changes, and it's going to drive permitting efficiencies and things like this. So you're going to see a lot more energy coming online, which is very bullish for uranium. But then also because of this tech put, these guys are buying power on long contracts, and they're buying everything they can get. And in addition to that, they are funding their own SMR projects. They're pairing with utilities to restart power plants. They're investing very heavily in technology and new types of modular reactors. And they're spending an enormous amount of money here. And in 2026, we're going to see it spike significantly, and it's going to continue to go up from here. We're going to see a lot of investment. And we have these diverging factors. So the grid is aging. Most zones in the United States and major utilities are already at or exceeding their safe levels of spare capacity. So there was already an issue. We already needed more power. The grid is aging. We have this electrification where people are plugging in their cars and they need more power. The grid needs to be beefed up to handle that throughput. Not only that, but now we have, and you'll see this not in 2026, but 2029, 2030, 2035, 2040, robotics. There's a big push now to put humanoid robots in factories, in homes. They can do dishes, they can clean, they can do all this, and it sounds very futuristic, but this is coming in the next 5 to 10 years, And all of those things need to be plugged in. And so the power is driving. And then you layer on top of this enormous data center demand. And we have a situation where we need a lot of power and we need it fast. Now let's talk about construction aggregates, because all of these things we're talking about require construction aggregates. Whether it's a new mine or a mineral processing facility or a data center or a nuclear power plant, they all need aggregates. So we have a mixed bag here. We have converging things and we have basically a K-shaped market emerging. So consumer sentiment is dropping. Unemployment will rise. It's going to be bouncy, but ultimately the trend is rising, and this is due to AI taking jobs. And people are going to need to be retrained, and they're going to need to learn new things, and we're going to need to shift some policies and find ways to backstop some of this and find ways to put people back to work when their jobs are taken by AI. And so in the consumer market and the residential market, I think this is very bearish in 2026 and beyond. But on the bullish side, all of these mega projects are driving consumption, and infrastructure spending will rise. We still have aging infrastructure, and it still needs to be replaced, and we still have a lot of growth in different regions that require highways and pipelines and all of that. So we have all these converging factors. We have infrastructure and industry is growing, and consumer sentiment is dropping. So you can see in this chart that I put, consumer sentiment is in decline, and it's projected to continue to decline, and mega project spending and infrastructure spending is increasing, and it's expected to increase. And so this is creating a K-shaped market, and we're seeing K-shaped markets emerging not just in construction aggregates. They're happening in a lot of different sectors of the economy, which is not a good sign, especially when we have people politically who are very polarized and charged, one side or the other, and then we have an economy that is splitting into a K-shape where it's really great for some people and really bad for a lot of other people. It causes a lot of discontent, and it's not a positive situation for the long term. But in construction aggregates, we're going to see strategic demand increasing a lot. So data center outlook is very high for 2026. For highways and bridges and infrastructure, we're at the peak cycle. We're still going through that IIJA funding, so that's increasing. Mega projects very high in certain markets like Phoenix, where we have the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing facility hitting multiple phases of building. Demand is in the hundreds of thousands plus tons of aggregates just for that single project, and there's other projects there that are very high demand. And then in residential, we're going lower. I think more stagnant is probably a good place to look at. With dropping interest rates, we could see things go to stagnant instead of dropping. And then light commercial is in a negative. It's in a decline. And that's post-COVID trends just continuing, where we have certain markets that are really hot and the rest of the country is flat to negative. So overall, a mixed bag for aggregates. If you have the right materials in the right market, you can expect a very great 2026. Otherwise, I think you can expect similar to 2024 and 2025 with some price appreciation due to depleting quarries near urban centers and a lack of just greenfield materials coming into the market. And so we're going to see more price appreciation. What does this all mean for US mining? Well, it means a lot. Covered a lot of it. There's a lot going on. The digital needs the physical. The AI revolution is starting to stall, not due to a lack of code and a lack of innovation, but a lack of copper and kilowatts. I'm proud of that one. I think that's a good way to put it. Security over efficiency. Supply chains are shifting from just in time to just in case. The best deposit in the world may not be the best anymore if it's on the wrong side of the fence. So we're seeing differences where grade does not matter as much as jurisdiction. Grade's always important for economics, but where it's at is key. And then we have the what I call the Burgex mandate, and what we need to keep a lookout for at Burgex is our clients don't just need data, they need a roadmap to navigate the regulatory and physical bottlenecks of this new industrial AI race and reality, and particularly in things like construction aggregates. I mean, a good market analysis and study and outlook of projects and where they're going and what they mean is more important than ever, and the ability to scale. So just base production to meet residential building and regular infrastructure needs may not cut it anymore. There may need to be ability to scale up and down for special projects, mega projects, things like that, in addition to keeping up with the regular demand. And then, of course, copper, domestic processing capability for critical minerals is all very important, will continue to be important. Precious metals are not going anywhere. This bull market's just getting started. There'll be ups and downs and dips, but it'll be really interesting to keep an eye on, and it's a great time to be exploring for most minerals in the United States. Thank you. Really appreciate you sitting down to listen to this. I hope my explanation and walkthrough was useful. I think the future belongs to those who secure the physical foundations today to build tomorrow, and thank you for building it with us. Feel free to download the report. Take a look, dig in, look at the data, read some comments. At the end of the report, I have some recommended reading, and it's some of those books like I talked about with Peter Zeihan and geopolitics, talking about the grid, talking about the bifurcation of the supply chain, the global supply chain, the shift from nationalism to globalism. And then, of course, plenty of reading about energy and AI and what's going on there, which is very exciting. There's a lot happening. Thanks for watching Mining Explorers episode 45. We will be back next week with Crystal, and we will have a great episode for you. And yeah, really looking forward to it. And thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. Leave some comments, subscribe. We'll see you next time.